Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Context Studio. This conversation is part of our banned book club series where we read like freedom depends on it. In this series, we talk with educators, readers, experts, and authors about books that have been challenged or removed from classrooms and libraries, and why these works continue to spark important conversations about history, culture, and human rights. For the second episode of our interview series, we're focusing on one of the most widely taught and widely debated novels in American classrooms, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. As you may have heard from my solo episode, this novel has been a staple of high school curriculum, introducing students to discussions about justice, racism, empathy, and moral courage in the context of the Jim Crow South. At the same time, this book has been increasingly become the subject of debates due to its portrayal of race, the presence of racial slurs, and the questions about how the story frames both justice and power. To explore what it actually looks like to teach this novel in the classroom, I'm joined today by Kirsten, an experienced English teacher who spent many years teaching To Kill a Mockingbird before it was eventually removed from her school's curriculum. We're going to talk about how she approached teaching the novel, how students respond to its themes, and what the current climate is around banned books and what that means for educators today. So, Kirsten, thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, I'm so glad I could chat with you today.
Yeah, really, really happy you're here and part of this discussion. I guess to start out, could you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about your background and what inspired you to become an English teacher?
Yes, of course. So my name is Kirsten. I live in Washington State in the United States, and I have been teaching English for 15 years. I loved teaching. One of my favorite books was The Great Gatsby, and that kind of really got me into, teaching because I wanted to share my passion and my love for that novel. And I'm fortunate to teach American literature at the school that I'm at, and so we get to explore things like To Kill a Mockingbird and the new books are bringing like Fences, The Great Gatsby, and so we can have these conversations with students. And it's getting harder and harder to be a teacher just with all the political climate and students being so phone and tech dependent. But anytime that we can get them to have these conversations, that's what makes this job worth staying in.
Could you share a little bit about the grade and the age level you teach?
Yes, so I teach high school English. I teach creative writing, public speaking, throw in sociology every couple of years. So currently, I'm teaching a 10th grade honors class, an 11th grade IB English class, public speaking, creative writing, and sociology. So I'm kind of on the spectrum of really, really high achieving students to students that just need to take an English credit so they can graduate high school. So it is interesting tailoring the curriculum to all the different learning strategies and needs.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I could imagine with that kind of big difference in the level of classes and the courses that there is a maybe a different level of engagement with each of the students. In regards to A Kill a Mockingbird, when did you first start teaching that in your classrooms?
So when I started teaching, I taught all American literature classes. So it was all 11th graders, and that was one of the books that was on our required teaching list. And we taught it in the part of our 1960s civil rights unit. So that was the first year I really taught the book, and actually. It was the first year that I had read it. I grew up in South Africa and then moved to the area when I was in eighth grade. And when I'm teaching at the high school, I actually went to as well. And so it was not one of the novels that was on the curriculum at that time. And so I think it kind of goes off and on our curriculum every couple of years, depending on, what's going on in the history, because we do block classes where history and English are taught together. So
Okay.
depending on what history needs, English will bring in some supporting literature. So we actually haven't taught To Kill a Mockingbird for about 6 years,
Yeah.
not because it's been banned, which I think is a good thing. There are some books that our school district, like Huck Finn, we don't teach anymore because of the use of the N word. But our district has also pushed for more inclusive, diverse novels. We can still teach it if we want to, but most people do A Raisin in the Sun, or like me, we teach August Wilson's Fences, which is a part of a larger series of plays that he wrote. Ours focuses on the 1950s and 1960s. It's a Black American author about Black Americans in the 50s and 60s. And so it's a much more authentic voice, not to say that Harper Lee or Mockingbird is not valid about the experiences, but coming from a Black man writing about being a Black man, it's nice to have that perspective. And none of our other novels are from Black American authors. So having August Wilson has been a positive for our curriculum, I think.
Oh, totally. Well, I'm going to need to get your reading list after that because I'm always just trying to get new books, hear those
Yes.
different perspectives. And I think what you touched on about the lived experience perspective is really, really crucial. Part of what makes To Kill a Mockingbird so interesting and also insightful is it was very important at the time. You know, it was that white child's perspective growing up and experiencing these things that I think society was in some ways just becoming aware of or just coming to terms to. So it made it a little bit easier to swallow than perhaps at the time a book written by a black man.
I mean, if we think about, Martin Luther King Jr. had to be really polite and nice in his messaging around let's forgive and everybody hold hands because it was easier for white Americans to swallow and to handle. You're right, it's too much for the American public in the 50s and 60s to handle.
Definitely, definitely. So I guess kind of considering that the context of now and before, what about this novel do you think made it such a staple in English curriculum for so many years then?
It's interesting because some schools teach it to middle schoolers, and then some, like my district, they do it in high school. And I think it's accessible, which is really important when we're talking about these really, we call them sticky topics or controversial topics here. If you can get the students to understand the text, then you can focus on having these bigger picture conversations about racism, about prejudice, about discrimination. And so the anchor text is understandable. It's in English that it's not, Shakespeare, and it's not Huck Finn. Sometimes they trip up on the language and the jargon and the slang, whereas this one is straightforward. The story, it progresses naturally, and students of all reading levels can really understand it. And I read a lot last night as I was thinking about this interview, and a lot of people criticize Harper Lee because she wrote a book that can be taught in middle school. But I think it's really valuable to have a book that all readers can access and understand. So.
Definitely. Actually, the first episode I did, I read Sold, and
Mhm.
which is a young adult novel by Patricia McCormick. It's amazing. And then going into To Kill a Mockingbird, and then now I'm reading Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
the type of dialogue, the type of writing is just so much more confusing. I was thinking, I was like, what is even happening in this story at first for the first few chapters? And then I realized I was kind of going from these stories that have a more simplified language
Mhm.
that convey really real stories, but are targeted to a wider audience, where Handmaid's Tale is not typically going to be targeted towards children, even middle school. I think the language definitely makes it more accessible to your point. You talked a little bit about the block class
Mhm.
setup. I was going to ask you next, what historical context do you feel like is needed for students when you introduce the book?
Yeah, so our block model is phenomenal, and you are a product of that. I didn't take block when I was at the school; my sister did, and it's amazing because you have the history and the English teacher together with anywhere between 50 and 60 students, and they're with you for 2 hours a day. You're with them, and you go through this journey. And the amazing thing about our 11th grade American history and lit classes is it's chronological and it's focused on one country, whereas ninth and 10th grade is world history or contemporary world issues or global studies. I mean, how do you cover global studies? It's the entire world. Whereas
Yeah.
American Lit, we kind of look at it with the Puritans and the Pilgrims arriving, and then we get as far as we can. So that is really nice to have the history being supported by the English. But then as an English teacher, I can focus more on techniques and purpose. And they already have the historical understanding and context for the novel from their history teacher. So the way that we approach Mockingbird when I taught it is it's set in the 30s. And so students already have the context of the poverty and the Ewell family being the poor whites, as they call it in the novel. They have that understanding of the South in the 1930s. And then we set it in the 1960s because that's when Harper Lee wrote it and it came out and the movie came out. And so we really spent a lot of time digging into the civil rights movement. We look at cases like the Scottsboro Boys, which were young African Americans who were accused of raping a white woman. They were found guilty of it, even though they were innocent, much like the Emmett Till case, where he's accused of whistling at a white woman. It's later years it comes out that it was all false accusations, but that did not matter at the time. So they understand both the 30s, the Great Depression, and then the 60s of the civil rights movement, and then the historical context of Black people being accused of these crimes. But because the victims were white, it didn't really matter if the evidence pointed to them being innocent. So then we get all of that, and then we dive into what's actually going on in To Kill a Mockingbird.
How do students typically respond when they first start reading the novel?
So it's not the first time that our students have talked about, prejudice and discrimination in American literature. We look at slavery, we look at the Jim Crow era in the 1930s as well, which some of them have read it. Some students, some middle school teachers do read it as part of book clubs or options. I would say less and less are reading it before they come to our class to read it. About 10, 15 years ago, I would say we had way more students that had already read it. I'm not going to say they're always excited to read because it is still an English class and I'm requiring them to read. It's a fairly long novel. There's a lot of other in the story with Boo Radley. And so sometimes they're like, this seems unnecessary. Can we just focus on the racism discrimination piece? But I think if we look at it as the larger picture, yes, it is about African American racism, but it's also about prejudice and discrimination against poor people, against people of color, single parent upbringings, dads raising their children, and Scout constantly told you need to be a lady. Your dad's not teaching you that. So you can make it more of those universal ideas of racism, discrimination, prejudice, and that helps with conversations as well.
It's really interesting that you mentioned Boo Radley because I actually didn't talk that much about him in my solo episode. Do you find that students are less open to that kind of the conversation about disabilities in the 60s and what that looks like?
And because of the time limit that we have on in our curriculum in our school year, we focus up more on African American discrimination. I think having it, I've not taught it for a couple of years now. Looking back on it, I would definitely be adding more of that and, leaning on my history teacher partner to maybe say what was going on with people that had disabilities in the 60s and what kind of discrimination did they face, much like we look at in the 60s and 70s, gay Americans and members of the LGBTQ plus community, that representation or that lack of representation. So Boo, especially when you watch it with the movie, I don't know if you've watched the movie or if you remember we
Yeah.
watched the movie,
Hmm.
the scene, it is a weird scene when they open the door and he's like behind the door and the students are like, oh my gosh, that's not what I pictured him to look like. So I
Yeah.
think that can sometimes be a little bit of a disadvantage because it becomes like a comedy piece.
Hmm.
And then, Scout running in her giant ham costume, sometimes I think that distracts from the overall message of the discriminations.
And I, to be honest, feel the same way. I think that even in Harper Lee's account, or I mean, in her story, that
Mhm.
it's a very undertouched aspect of it. So,
Yes.
I mean, Boo Radley, he's kind of this fantasy fictional monster, for a lack of a better
Yes.
word, that the kids have made up in their head. And I don't think, yes, at the end, it comes out that he saved them. And so that,
Mhm.
provides them some empathy. But I don't think that they really unpack the character or unpack aspects of that story the way that they do with the criminal justice system with Tom Robinson,
Mhm.
even Calpurnia, her character. A lot of people criticize Calpurnia's character and say that she's not forward enough or there isn't enough representation. But I actually think she's one of the most crucial characters within the book itself for showing them, taking them to the First Purpose Church
Yes.
and showing them kind of what life actually looks like to be part of such a heavily segregated community.
And she's a nice foil for the kid's aunt, who's a little bit by the book and very racist. And so Calpurnia, especially for Scout, is a different perspective of what it means to be a female, but then also an African American female. So I
Totally.
like her as a character too.
Yeah, I guess now moving into the specifics of the novel. So, as
Mhm.
we've been saying, this novel has been challenged for their intense topics or sticky themes. I like that phrase that you said,
Mhm.
connected to racial injustice, also sexual abuse,
Mhm.
disability, and primarily and predominantly the use and inclusion of racial slurs. So,
Mhm.
when you were setting the frameworks and the scene for the conversations in the class, how do you address things like that?
Yes. So the first few years that I taught Mockingbird, I also taught Huck Finn by Mark Twain. And we taught that at the beginning of the year in September, October, as part of slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, kind of heading into Jim Crow. And so they had a lot of context because the N word is used in that book like 230 times. And so it's excessive, but it's excessive for a purpose. You should definitely do Huck Finn as one of your banned books as well. So, because a
Yeah.
lot of people misunderstand the purpose of including it in that book, but as well as Mockingbird. And if we're looking at the book, the word being used in an authentic way, both Mark Twain and Harper Lee use it because that is how it was used in the the 30s or in the late 1800s. And so I think a lot of people get tripped up thinking, oh, it's so excessive, the use of the N word. But you have to approach it as this is a historical view of this time period, and that's what the authors are trying to do. So when we do Huck Finn, we talk about how Mark Twain uses the N word a lot. We don't use it when we are reading quotes or when we are talking about it. We say African Americans, or we say, Black Americans, as the term African American is being phased out and Black Americans is being reclaimed more. And then when we get To Kill a Mockingbird, we can remind students, hey, this is not the terms that we're going to be using. Here's the history of it. We do a lot of lessons around the meaning of the N word, the power of the N word when white people say it versus African American community members. There's a lot of works that have come out, a lot of works that really deal with African American authors talking about the power of the N word. And so we've used excerpts from that as well. I use those when we do fences and we do slavery as well. Like, yes, this word is used in these works. We don't have the right to use those words. And I'm a white teacher, and I'm like, okay, we are not using this word. And I give them other ways to approach it and address it with the understanding of the history and the language that has changed around the use of the N word.
Totally. I guess kind of building off of that, is there ever pushback from students who maybe are aware of some of the bans or the inappropriate language that is used in the novel?
In the couple of years that I did Huck Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird, we never had any students ask about it because I think we front load a lot of it with here's the history of the word, here's a lesson on the racism in America coming off the end of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow. So I think by doing a lot of that front loading, we don't get a lot of pushback or questioning of why we're including these novels. I also think our school district does a great job of saying, hey, we're going to look at these historical novels. We're going to understand the history of them, the cultural context. We have a lot of support on teaching these controversial, sticky topics. And so that is really helpful as well as we approach it. Students can always opt out of any of our curriculum, any of our literature. I've never had anybody opt out of To Kill a Mockingbird before.
Right. Okay. And what about among teachers? When you have conversations with other
Mm-hmm.
teachers about how to present that novel, is everyone really aligned, or what kind of diverse opinions would come up in those spaces?
Yeah, I mean, we are aligned. We've had phenomenal teachers in the past who have shared work. They've brought in a lot of resources that we've added to our curriculum. We've never really had anybody say, hey, we can't do this. You can't
Yeah,
just pretend the N word wasn't used by slave owners and by white people to degrade and dehumanize African Americans because that's whitewashing history. And there's some bad things that have happened in American history, and we have to acknowledge that. And so by just saying we're not going to teach this book, that's doing a disservice to the people who experienced racism and slavery, but then it's a disservice to our students today who need to learn this was a reality and we cannot let this happen again. It's like not teaching the Holocaust book because it's violent. You have to understand the reality of life at the time.
definitely. And I think that's a really good analogy, especially because The Diary of Anne Frank is another one of those stories that's been challenged recently in schools and curriculums, which is just beyond me, as most of this is. But I think to me that's why To Kill a Mockingbird is a very interesting case because
Mhm.
I'm against censorship of literature in general. That's why I've started this series. That's why I think it's so important to have these conversations, and also why I think it's important to continue having these books in the classrooms or at least in libraries. When you use these types of harmful languages, there is that repercussion if it's not handled correctly.
Mhm.
Do you think that the presence of racially harmful language is necessary at times to convey the reality of the racism in the past?
Yes and no. I don't think we choose literature because it has the use of the N word. I also think it's important for students to read these novels that show themes of discrimination and racism and prejudice, the impacts of slavery, systemic and racism in America. So you have to be able to show those. And if those texts happen to have racial slurs, that's part of understanding it. And so you do have to build into your curriculum an ability for students to understand the history of the language and the words. I mean, just like, when we're talking about gay people, we wouldn't use the F word, or we just finished reading a book called Nisei Daughter about Japanese internment, and they use that JAP.
Hmm.
We don't use that today, but that was what they would call Japanese Americans during Pearl Harbor and after Pearl Harbor. So you have to use that word as a lesson in racism and why it was wrong, and but also to understand the history and the historically accurate language being used at the time.
Of course. No, I think that totally makes sense. It does really capture that historical moment. Were there moments where you noticed students kind of experiencing realizations or maybe their perspectives shifted in conversations before or after?
I think when we do Emmett Till and Scottsboro Boys, students understand that African Americans have a very different criminal justice system than white people do in America. But when you show the pictures of young teenage Emmett Till or the Scottsboro Boys, and I think one of them was as young as like 9 or 10, and
Yeah.
so you show their pictures and you have family members talking about it. And with Emmett Till, you have Mrs. Till showing his mutilated corpse to the media, and it's important for us to be able to talk about this. And that is when the students had these ideas of like, this is real people, this is not just a book that we're reading in class. They do have those realizations that this is innocent people and it's real life. We can look at it 50, 60, 70 years later and think, that's in the past. That's not that far in the past.
No.
Like, I mean, Emmett Till's mother just died within the last 15, 20 years. Martin Luther King Jr.'s relatives are still alive. Harper Lee died in 2016. And so this is still recent history. They have that realization like, hey, this is not 500 years in the past. This is still part of the American cycle, the racism and the discrimination.
How long ago did you stop teaching this book in classes? What was kind of the
Yeah.
time period?
I think at the beginning, like a year or two before COVID in 2020, is when we phased out Mockingbird and brought in Fences by August Wilson. Some teachers still taught Mockingbird for a few years. You were definitely able to do that. You had that choice as part of our postmodernism unit, or you could teach it in the 60s with civil rights movement. But now most of us do Raised in Our Fences, and because we need a play. We used to teach the Crucible. The Crucible has gone away, and we need a play. So we use Fences and Raisin in the Sun as that play, really primary text where we can look at racism in America.
Do you think that the shift in the political climate, in terms of with the Black Lives Matter movement and all of that rise in the conversation, I mean, I
Mhm.
think, if you were clued into it, this has been a conversation for a very long time. But I think a lot of people in my generation, I mean, including myself in a lot of ways, that time period really woke up a lot of people and raised a lot of awareness, especially with that video of George Floyd, what happened to Breonna Taylor, just a few
Mhm.
examples in my head. Do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement had anything to do with that shift?
I don't think so because, as you said, we've been having these conversations for a while. I think that was not a big push because we had been discussing getting rid of Mockingbird and we had already gotten rid of Huck Finn at that point. Um, I think we always evaluate our curriculum and our content to make sure that we are including more students. This school, when I went here 20 years ago, used to be predominantly white.
Mhm.
And, in the last 20, 25 years, we're seeing a lot more students of color and people from Asian countries that are coming and India coming. And so we want to incorporate more of that voice, that representation of those diverse groups. So, we brought in Fences to look at African American authors. We do Nisei Daughter. She's a Japanese American author from Seattle. We still have Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, who's white. And we do The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, who's white, but he's a war veteran. And so anytime that we can be including more of those other voices, I think with the Black Lives Matter, your generation, social media is the worst thing, but also the best thing because it's that access to that information. And you guys, as you said, you were waking up and realizing, hey, this has always happened, but I come from a place of privilege, either with my skin color, my socioeconomic status. I can't ignore this though now. It's all over my social media. And I think sometimes it becomes a trend and it's popular, but I don't also think that's a bad thing because the more eyes you get on it and the more voices that are being shared, I think that's only a good thing for these kind of issues. So just that access to that information, good and bad.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, you said it perfectly, it's the best thing and the worst thing
Mhm.
ever. I think it allows us to really understand what's happening. I mean, think about what's happening even in Iran right now. I think because of social media, people are able to really understand what's happening there
Mhm.
differently than what was able to be understood about what was happening in Afghanistan post
Yes,
9/11. I mean, very
absolutely.
similar atrocities. I mean, they're both war zones at this point.
Mhm.
And so I think with social media, we're able to see that, but I also think there is a risk to that. I
Yeah.
totally agree with you there. Going back to the novel, looking back on your years of teaching it, what do you think students gained the most from reading that novel?
Mhm.
Mhm.
I think when you really focus on the court scene, some years I've shown the entire film, and some years I would just show the court scenes. I think that is the most impactful part for students because they're seeing the absolute racist and failures of the Southern court systems, but overall the American justice system. And so, you have the segregated balconies to start off, just that visual piece in the film as well. And then the novel you have, Tom Robinson clearly innocent. And I don't think that is me being biased because I believe in diversity or equality. He's clearly innocent. And I
Yeah.
think she does that intentionally so that you're like smacked over the head with this is an innocent person.
Hmm.
And so I think that whole scene and the hope that you maybe feel that, yeah, Atticus is a great lawyer. He's reached the jury, he's convinced them, and then it's no, he's guilty. And so I think it's disappointing and it's heartbreaking for students when they had that hope, but then it's you have to talk about the reality was there was no hope. I mean, they probably prolonged the discussion just to make it look better that they're not like, oh no, he's guilty, right? So
Totally. Totally. And I mean, I think that was one of the things that really stuck. I think it even stuck with me more than it did when I was reading it in when I was younger because,
yeah.
Jem saying like, "Oh, Scout, you don't understand. He's gonna get off. It's fine. It's fine." And then the way he was in tears afterwards and I also found it so like the right word maybe is innocent, but the way he
Mhm.
was like, "Oh, well, we'll just get rid of juries. You can just go to the Alabama courts and
Yes.
legislator and tell them to change this," because I think that is such a for someone who doesn't have an awareness of these injustices, whether you're a child, whether you're an adult just encountering these things for the first time, that to me is such a logical reaction. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
well, just change this, just change that. And the fact that he can't and that none of that can change, I think that is where the message really, really hits. I mean, the
Yes.
court scene, again, it's this intense dynamic where you're, will they, won't they? Mayella's crying, the father is left-handed. Like all these little
Gosh, yes.
details are coming out then, but I think the weight of the criminal injustice in that
Mhm.
moment really hit after, for me at least, when they were leaving the courthouse.
Yes, yeah, and they stand up, and the movie does such a great job of having that scene, and I can't watch that scene or read that scene without getting choked up a little bit. And as preparing for this, I was reading some of the criticism about the court scene, and how, as you talked about, Jem thinking, oh, it's going to be great, it's going to be great, let's change thing. And some people criticize the novel for not doing enough to address the racism, but we also have to remember it's from Scout's perspective. She's a little child, and so showing it very narrow and maybe not the full depth of racism, that's appropriate for a child.
Mhm.
That's what makes the novel accessible, because even students who are lowest on the academic spectrum, they are maybe thinking the same things that Scout and Jem are thinking. And so this gives them a way to kind of buy into the conversation of, oh, I'm thinking the same thing too, but I'm not going to admit that. So I'm going to use Scout or Jem's characters to enter the conversation about discrimination and prejudice and racism.
Totally. I mean, this kind of reminds me of something Patricia McCormick said in the last interview about how books they're intimate in a way and they're private. So you can read these, you can unpack these things for yourself. Maybe it's things that you've experienced, maybe it's things that you haven't experienced, but it gives you a safe and private place to learn and understand these stories. And I understand the criticism because that was a lot of what I found as well, is that these stories were not unpacked. And there's parts of that I agree with and parts I disagree with, but I also think, yeah, it's coming from a child's perspective. A child is not going to have this inherent understanding of how the criminal justice system works, the
Mhm.
injustices around there. And so asking these questions, I think, were also very timely questions for probably what adults might have been thinking during this time when
Mhm.
all of this was happening in 1960.
Yeah, because maybe some of them, it's not like today where we have social media where everything is blasted everywhere. you could live your life and kind of ignore the racism that existed in the criminal justice system. And this novel gives you that entryway to think about it. So, and it's the accessibility. I keep going back to that. It's an accessible novel for all readers.
Definitely, definitely. I couldn't agree with that more. You had mentioned that this book was removed from your school curriculum and kind of highlighted it was as part of incorporating the voices of lived
Mhm.
experience. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah. So every couple of years, we do a cycle of curriculum adoption. And so the district will decide here's going to be your required novel. So it'll be, The Great Gatsby, or it'll be a play or something. And so we used to have, Huck Finn, The Great Gatsby, To Kill a Mockingbird, and then we could pick a postmodern book. And so our cycle came up and we looked at the curriculum that we had, and it was white author, white author, white author. Oh, more white authors. And
Yeah.
then maybe a few poems by Emily Dickinson or Sylvia Plath to get some woman there with their mental health struggles or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And so we're looking at, this is not representing, they present to the school district, here's the population breakout in terms of race and gender and socioeconomic status and things like that. And you look at that, and if it's, 20% this race, 20% that race, and then you look at your novels and it's 100% white people, students aren't seeing themselves in the curriculum. And all the studies have shown that in order for students to buy into the curriculum and feel successful in school, is they have to feel connected to it. We brought in the different novels because student voice is so incredibly, and student representation is so incredibly important if we want students who are less engaged in school every single year to become engaged in the curriculum.
I couldn't agree more with that point as well. I know one of the other criticisms around this book was about the white savior complex and
Yes.
specifically kind of going back to the court scene we're talking about. What is your perspective on that? And then the other side of that, what are students' perspective of that?
The first time I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, Atticus Finch, you did such a great job. You are the hero. You
You're the
saved the day, even
man.
though you didn't save it. Yes, you are amazing. Look what you did. You put your reputation on the line. But then the more I taught it, and you approach each novel and you look at the current criticism and the theories and perspectives, the more I read it, the more that kept coming up. And then especially when Harper Lee supposedly released Go Set a Watchman, and Atticus Finch was this outright KKK member racist in the 50s. If you think about it, when he does the presentation to the jury, he doesn't talk about Tom Robinson's family or his standing in the community or who he is as a person. It's more this philosophical thing on the justice system and, I'm a lawyer and I'm doing this. And so you can understand how people might see that.
Mhm.
But then you contrast that with the lynch mob that goes to the jail to get Tom Robinson, and Atticus stands in front of them and says, like, you're not going to do this. But then you also have Scout and Jem being like, oh, I know your daughter. I play with them in school and things like that.
Yeah.
But again, it's the white people being the heroes.
Hmm.
And I'm sure that has a lot to do with, because in the 30s, a black community was not going to go in front of a bunch of white lynchers and say, hey, let's stop this, because they're going to be lynched as well. And there was no repercussions for that. So I understand the criticism. I agree with it. But I also think that was the reality of the time, is the white person had to be the savior. If we look at Martin Luther King Jr., he couldn't just as a black man change everything. He had to get white ministers and preachers and white supporters to vouch for him, essentially. And that's what Atticus has to do for Tom Robinson. His is not successful. You can understand the white savior piece because it's historically accurate, I think.
I agree with that actually a lot. And I even think, there's 2 points to it. One, nobody was really saved in that. But even towards the end, when he was like, oh, we're going to get an appeal, we're going to win. Why did
Mhm.
Tom Robinson try to escape? Like, what do you mean, why did he try to
Yeah.
escape? He knew the system was against him. Atticus
Mhm.
just believed in himself so much. And I mean, you could argue he was willing to put his family's safety on the line for that. And you could argue that he was doing that because there was such an injustice happening. But
Mhm.
I do
Mhm.
think reflecting on it, and even reflecting on it since I put out my video, I do agree, I think in part with that aspect of it of the white savior complex. I don't think it's
Mhm.
entirely there, especially because the perspective is from the children. Of course,
Mhm.
they're young, they're going to idolize their father. It's
Yes,
a retelling from their perspective. But I
absolutely.
definitely think that, you know, there was an overindulgence, maybe is the
Mhm.
right word, in the Atticus character of it all. I mean,
Absolutely.
and
Yes.
even in the movie, I felt like actually the movie was a little bit more about Atticus than it was
Mhm.
about Tom Robinson, even about Scott and Jem. It was framed
Mhm.
from their perspective, but I think, Atticus, I mean, it was Gregory Peck, of course.
Yeah.
So everyone was like,
Everyone.
put him on the screen as long as we can. But
Absolutely, yeah. And some of the criticism I was reading last night with the book is that, oh, he's not emotional enough when the verdict is read, and then you see Gregory Peck like getting emotional, and so it's like, oh, there, he's emotional enough, and so we can look at that. It does impact him, but yeah, it's is he naive thinking that it's going to work, the appeal, or is he that conceited or confident, and as you said, in his own abilities, that the appeal is going to work? Because Tom Robinson, as you said, knew that it was not going to work, and that's why he runs.
yeah, yeah, exactly. How did you feel about how the movie was portrayed, the story versus the book? I mean, I noticed in the movie there were different aspects of it that were left out, specifically with Mayella and her father. I kind of just see this as more of the sign of the times that this movie was not able to address things that were, about familial incest and sexual
Yes.
abuse. That was really, really heavy. And I think also even in the book, it was very much just like something really slid under the table, wasn't really
Yes.
discussed. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
No, I absolutely agree. It's alluded to because, as you said, it's the 1960s. They're not going to be talking about incest and rape overtly because that was, I mean, they couldn't even say the word pregnant on TV or have beds next to each other in I Love Lucy. So they're not talking about rape and incest in movies or in books. And so I think it does filter it. I think the one reason I like the film is there's less of a focus on like the other parts of the story and more of a focus on the racism and the injustices of the justice system. Like the character Dill, the little friend, and it's there's less and less of that. And you understand because movies are 2 hours or an hour and a half, whereas a novel can be 400 or 500 pages. So they can get into more of the details. So I think one positive of the film is the focus more on the racism, whereas the book, it's that was one of my criticisms with Huck Finn, is there's so much other stuff that Mark Twain uses to show how stupid white people can be sometimes when it comes to African Americans, that I felt like you lose some students some of the times because it's like, oh, here's this, okay, here's this plot part. What are we doing again? And then you come back to the trial, or you come back to, Huck Finn and Jim's journey down the river. So I think the film kind of keeps it concise a little bit more so.
Yeah, I mean, and I like the film. I want to say that as well. I think it's a great film. I just thinking about it more from this critical
Mhm.
analysis perspective. I think it's important to kind of notice and bring up these things. What
Yes.
about what students say? I mean, after reading the novel, do you feel like their perspective has changed from before they started the novel? Were there any critiques or maybe any insight that students shared that you felt particularly moved you?
If I'm being honest, I think because I'm teaching it in this time period and not the 60s or 70s, students are less and less shocked about the reality of racism in America because we intentionally teach it, but they also have access to things. They see, George Floyd and Trayvon Martin, and they see the injustices there. And so it's just a continuation of the reality that they live in. The reactions are not like massive, like, I can't believe this is happening in America, because they're seeing it happen in America in real time in current events.
Right. I mean, and that's good, right? That shows that the
Mhm.
times are changing and that there is an awareness of this. And but like as a society, I think that there definitely are to fight against these injustices and advocate. Yeah, on a personal level, at a system level, there's so many ways to do it. And I think it's really cool. I mean, I see with my peers, I see with people
Mhm.
younger than me, how they're trying to get engaged in these things. I was just having dinner with a friend and her daughter was there who's I think 13 and she was asking me, and she was like, "Have you
Yeah.
heard about Northern Ireland?" And I was
Mm.
like, "What do you mean Northern Ireland?" And she started telling me all about the wall that's there and the segregation. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, you're 13. Like, you're so passionate about this and the problems that are coming." And then she showed me these videos of the different soldiers on each side that had been in
Mhm.
jail. And like, I think there is such a huge push and awareness for people to get involved in advocacy and injustice and even care about human rights now.
Mhm. Yeah, my worry, if I can be pessimistic for 3 seconds here, is
Yeah.
they fail in Mockingbird.
Uh-huh.
We fail in Breonna Taylor. We fail in George Floyd. We fail with Trayvon Martin. It's constant fighting, 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 and then failing. I don't want students to read something like Mockingbird and think, well, there's no use in trying anymore. I want students to feel like they have a voice and to feel like they have a power. So you have to be so careful with how you approach it, because you don't want to destroy their abilities or their confidence in change in the systems, because it does feel very negative lately that, it's just bad news, bad news, bad news, bad news constantly. So
Well, I guess I'll kind of push it back to you. And how do you frame the discussions to kind of make students feel optimistic and hopeful? Because I encounter that all the time in my
yeah.
work when I worked with social workers, working in advocacy, even doing my master's last year. I think some people are burnt out, some people
Mhm.
feel powerless. People say there's no point in voting, which I will
Mhm.
always say is not the case. We have the right to do it. I think it's important to do it. I have these conversations with people all the time. How do you navigate those?
I think it's about balance, but I think showing them that things can actually change and things will change if people speak up. You can vote, and there's some positive news that's coming back where people are starting to push back on things that current political people are doing bad, like the bad things that they're doing. There's some wins now. So if you can focus on the wins, and this protest happened with Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Selma, and then these things happened, and you can't ignore it any longer. So people made these changes. So you show the reality of not every movement is going to be successful, but then you can show that there are some that are successful to keep them inspired and keep them engaged. I can't vote in this country. I have a green card. I'm not an American citizen. And to see people so apathetic, like, whatever, I don't care who wins, that Jesus take the wheel or my God has more power. That's a lovely perspective. And I really respect people that have that faith, but it's also not the reality and the lived reality for a lot of people. So you do have to vote. You have to stay engaged with the good and the bad that we're seeing. And so we just try to teach our students, be engaged. You are going to be voting in a year or two or three. We want to teach them critical thinking and stay informed. Don't listen to only what your parents are telling you or only what your friends are saying. Do your own research and be your own person, and then make those informed decisions. So
Well, and even on social media, I constantly have to, remind myself to look around and look outside of just my own echo chamber because everything I see on my feed, it's all of my peers and all of the people I look up to that echo what I'm saying. And so it's so easy to be like, oh my gosh, I am right. Like it is exactly like this. And I've been really, really lucky in my life to have been around so many people that have challenged me, that have pushed back. And I'm so, so grateful for that because I like to believe everyone comes from a good perspective with things, but unfortunately, that's not always the reality. And you have to, look at all sides of it, I think, to come up with your own opinion, whether you fall in the middle, sometimes left or right. The most important thing is that you understand. And that's something I'm challenging people to do with this book club. I'm not here to try to tell people think this or think that. I'm trying to say read it for yourself and understand. Because when I was speaking with Patricia McCormick, she was telling me all about these websites where it just has one or two pages of the book, and it's constantly these pages that are referenced at these banned book groups and at the school boards. And half of these people have never even read the book, but they're just seeing these small excerpts from it, and that's what they're presenting. So, yeah, I think it's really important to be critical and also handle kind of discomfort and the uncomfortable
yes.
conversations. Going back to kind of the question, do you think that discomfort in a classroom is something that's essential to learning? And how do you kind of navigate that?
There's a safe space that you create for students where they can openly discuss these topics. That is not the same as the discomfort piece. And I think the people that are trying to ban these books think, oh, well, you're making students feel sad. We can't do that. Or you're making them feel bad about American history. We can't do that. That discomfort needs to happen
Hmm.
because we're seeing a rise in the KKK and racism and white supremacy and anti-Semitism. And if we don't have students think about how horrible racism was or the Holocaust was, we're doomed to repeat that because we're already on that cycle. And that is really scary to see. I feel uncomfortable sometimes in my day. Does that mean I shouldn't do those things? I mean, I'd never teach ever again. Like
Yeah.
if I only felt good and safe all the time. And so I think we create the safe space that allows students to feel things.
Hmm.
joy, sadness, anger. They can be angry with me, they can be angry with the system, but they have to feel something. We need to get students to feel stuff. And it's been infuriating as a teacher to look at these, like the woke anti-woke bills in Florida and the don't say gay bills, and oh, let's just, let's not teach slavery anymore because it's sad, or the textbooks that say, oh, slaves had barbecues with their masters. That's garbage. Both sides of the argument. What are the both sides of the Holocaust? What are the both sides of racism or slavery? Like, there's no two perspectives on that. It's wrong. There's also, you have to be very careful as an educator in this world. I frame it that I'm teaching you to think critically, but there are also some things that are black and white or right and wrong. And we're not going to shy away from saying, like, hey, slavery was wrong.
Yeah,
The Holocaust was bad. I'm not going to show you the other side because there is no other side to these things. And
right.
luckily, we're in a liberal state, fairly open minded community that does encourage a lot of inclusion and diversity. And I'm speaking in general terms here. Obviously, not everybody's that way, but we do have a lot of support. We a few years ago did a lesson on social justice with Black Lives Matter and the police brutality. And some parents of not really our community, the right wingers and the conspiracy theorists freaked out about us doing it because we presented correct data, and our school backed us up. Our district backed us up and said, we are going to talk about these things. It's in the current media. It's a reality. And plus, it's all grounded in data, statistics, information. It's not these teachers like these social justice warriors trying to brainwash our children to become cats in school. It's the reality. It's what's actually happening.
Has there been an increasing pressure on schools and districts to censor literature in classrooms to align with certain views? Do you feel like educators have more pressure or fear
Mhm.
around teaching these controversial topics?
Me personally, no. In America, the larger sense, absolutely. Even with COVID, where the rhetoric was teachers are lazy, they don't want to open schools because they hate students, they don't want to work. There's
Crazy.
always this anti-teacher rhetoric, and no matter what we do, we're wrong. But our district is fairly supportive. But I think there is a lot more conversations with the last election cycle where you see a lot of really, really extremist school board people running. Like a majority of them lost, thankfully, because they are the ones that are like, it can only be straight, white, rich characters in every single story. We only feel joy in everything that we read. There's a lot of pushback on that, which gives me hope. Like, people are waking up to, no, it's okay to feel uncomfortable and to have diversity and to include all voices in our curriculum. America was built on immigrants and diversity. Why are we pretending that that's not the reality of this country?
Totally. And do you feel like keeping these books in classrooms helps protect students and encourage these types of conversations?
Yes. And I mean, as I mentioned earlier, our students can opt out of any curriculum. For the most part, we don't see students doing that. And so I think it is really important to have these safe spaces where students can understand the history of the novels, but then also have these conversations around racism and prejudice and all the other things that we're teaching. I think we need to provide that safe space. And as a parent, my job is to protect my children and to teach them to think critically, but also teach them the values that I want them to have. It's my job to say, you can't read this or you can't watch that. So the schools or the libraries are supposed to present the variety of curriculum and books and art and movies and things like that. And it's not their job to say you can and cannot learn this. That's my job as a parent. So if I don't want my daughter to read something, I'll tell her you're not reading it. The school shouldn't be telling her not to read it.
Yeah, and I mean, as we were speaking about earlier, these books, they can show people new experiences and then also
Mhm.
help students to understand some of their own experiences in a private and intimate kind of closed space where they can process their stories, they can process what they're hearing, they can ask questions to teachers or trusted adults, even to their own parents. And that's one of the most important things about having these stories be available. It helps young people and adults alike deal with conversations about racism relating to Kill a Mockingbird, injustice, and deeper issues, even like sexual abuse or
Mhm.
disability advocacy or different things like that. And I definitely can understand how in this political climate, especially with groups like Liberty for Moms and all of
Mhm.
that, there's such a huge pushback for these stories. And again, as I mentioned earlier, most of these people are not even reading these books. They're just
No,
finding the clips online.
no. And I always think, I've had students in the past as part of marginalized or oppressed groups. And as I said, I come from a place of privilege. My family is not poor. I'm white. Yes, I am an immigrant in this country, but I'm an English speaking white immigrant. So I've never really faced any discrimination or prejudice or anything like that. Even as a woman, I think of, an African American student being told we can't teach this book because your experience makes people feel sad or uncomfortable. Like, that's so heartbreaking that they're not going to have their voice represented or their experience or their family's experience represented because it might make somebody else feel sad. Like, that's no, that's not how the real world is.
Right. And I think in some ways it totally others them, right, in these
Yes.
spaces. And it kind of creates like, oh, this is separate. We're just not going to acknowledge it. We're going to pretend that this didn't happen. And it just further kind of isolates people that maybe even be in those cases or may have family members that are still in the criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm.
And by just kind of completely ignoring those voices, you're not allowing them the ability to process it. And also, you're not allowing students and young people, in the case of schools, the ability to understand more. You're limiting their ability to learn and empathize in that
Mm-hmm.
matter.
Mm-hmm. And we could definitely use more empathy in this world where I always tell my students, like, you should experience things now and, experiment and try things because this is the safe space and the real world is dark and hard and nasty enough. So find the joy now because once you graduate, it's kind of a smack in the face with reality, unfortunately.
And also I think I really like the term someone mentioned to me, failing forward. You can
Mhm.
make mistakes because
Mhm.
if you're in the right setting, you're in a place where even the discomfort, if you're
Mhm.
uncomfortable with the racial injustice, it should make you feel bad. And maybe there's things in your environment that are not allowing you to have that empathy or those experiences because your family, maybe they don't support
Yes.
things that are mentioned in that story. And
Mhm.
school can be a place for you to maybe make mistakes in the way you talk about it or the way that you understand it because you're in a place where the conversation can be facilitated.
Yes, yeah, and we do. I mean, we have conversation norms in the beginning of the year. We share them, and we don't expect you to always be perfect. That's not my intention. And so you can admit your mistakes. And if you say, hey, I don't really understand why using the N-word is that big of a deal, we can have that further conversation because you want every student to understand the full reality of everything. And if they're not understanding, as you said, what in their life is stopping them from understanding the harm of this word, we should be providing those safe spaces for those conversations.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, it sounds like the classroom environment you're putting forward, the school is putting forward is really facilitating that in a successful way, which is really, really happy to hear. If teachers like yourself want to teach difficult books responsibly today, what do you think that should look like?
I think collaboration with others in your department or other schools that are teaching the same thing. There's so much out there nowadays with social media and with just the internet that you can look at what other people have done. And, when you're approaching, the N word, look at what Black authors are saying. There's a lot of literature in the last couple of years on how to teach these books that use the N word, or also understanding the history of the language and the historical context of the novel. That's key as you as an educator approach it. And then when you teach it to students, they have to also be made aware of, yes, the N word is used 230 times, but Mark Twain does this intentionally. And yes, we see the failures of the criminal justice system in To Kill a Mockingbird, but that was also the reality of the time period. So giving students the broader picture of the novel or the film that you're teaching is going to be key. It's going to protect you as an educator if you frame it in that context, but it's also gives them that framework to enter the conversations around like why there's this use of this word or the other different slurs that are used in other novels. So giving everybody the tools and the framework is going to be important.
Definitely, I couldn't agree more. And I guess for our final question, if schools and libraries are debating on whether or not to keep or remove books like this, what is
Mhm.
one message that you want decision makers to understand?
I think the biggest thing is that we should not be censoring works. We have the Diary of Anne Frank, but we also have Mein Kampf. You have to understand the history, and if we can't just say, oh, I feel uncomfortable or this was not very nice to read. You cannot approach teaching subjects that way. You have to give students the ability to read a variety of texts. And so I think school boards and districts and parents, they have to understand that we need students to have access to these books, these movies. We don't want to repeat the past. So if we are giving teachers the tools to teach these things correctly, then we should allow students to read these works as well.
No, it totally does. I mean, I think we've touched on this throughout the interview, but I just want to highlight again and, experience that discomfort in a safe and healthy space, whether you're uncomfortable because you relate to aspects of it and that's something that you're processing, or whether you're uncomfortable because you can't relate to any of it and you feel badly about that. I think, as you said, this classroom is a safe space where students can fail forward and they can make mistakes and learn. And I think a lot of inspiration comes from these periods, whether the students or young people recognize it or not.
Yes. And I think if we tell the people with power that you censor a book, think about the voice of that student that you are censoring as well.
Hmm.
You can't read this book because it makes people feel sad. Well, that student has an experience that you're invalidating, or you're saying it's not really important enough or good enough to incorporate into the curriculum or incorporate into our discussion. So if you make it about humans versus the novels, I think it's hard to just, oh, we're not going to do it. You can't just ban it outright because then you're banning voice.
Totally. Well, thank you so, so much, Kirsten, for sharing your experiences and perspective as an educator. And conversations like this really remind us that teaching literature is about much more than just reading a book. It's also about helping students engage with history, empathy, and the complexities about the world around them, and also maintain an understanding of their peers in these spaces. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this episode. Remember, we're reading like our freedom depends on it, and reading in the context helps us better understand the systems, histories, and ideas that shape us. So we'll see you next time on the Context Studio. Thanks for joining.